Right. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us in the second in this season of the Dare Dallas webinars. Thank you ever so much for joining us. I hope you're all keeping cool. And today, I'm really privileged to be joined by Jonathan Horwich, who is one of our contemporary art specialists. Jonathan, the subject of today's webinar, modern British sculpture. Can you just define to us what is modern British sculpture and why, when we look at the difference between flat art, as I know you art specialists like to call it, and sculpture, where does it lie in the hierarchy of things?
I think increasingly more important, as it were, as art specialists between us in quiet moments or in darkened rooms, we would describe two elements of art. That's flat art, as you say, and everything else is bumpy. So furniture gets to be bumpy and other carpets. Anything that isn't a flat art picture is bumpy. So I've been used to doing flat and bumpy art for years, and officially sculpture is bumpy, and modern British sculpture just happens to be my favourite subject.
And what brought you into British sculpture?
Sorry, say again?
What brought you into modern British sculpture? What made you kind of look at it? Because I think everyone knows you for being one of the world's most preeminent Lowry experts, Churchill experts, but specifically in terms of sculpture, what brought you into the fold?
If you wind back probably about 20 years, I couldn't understand why there wasn't more of it. I think the difference between flat art pictures and prints and this is that people, and I include all of us, me and you and everyone, think, well, if I buy a piece of sculpture, I have to put it somewhere, or I have to think where it needs to go, whereas a flat picture is something you can put anywhere. So I thought, well, no, this can't be right. People should see more of this, even if they don't buy it. They should be more aware of a whole group of artists who only practice as sculptors. I even remember attempting to put together an auction which was exclusively sculpture. It didn't quite come off because, to be honest, there isn't quite enough of it to fulfill a regular sale. So it's always part of something, but it just needs its own focus.
But I think a lot of the people that are watching today will know some of the names that we're going to talk about. So clearly there is a certain kind of amount of knowledge around there that kind of sits with some of the big names that are involved in British sculpture.
Yes, if you start to reel them off, and hopefully as we go through, some of the people we talk about will resonate, and either think people remember things that they've seen, and a lot of this can be seen outdoors. The first name that comes to mind probably for most people is Henry Moore, who was born just before the First World War, and we're going to just see now a video of Henry talking in 1974 and telling us, we need to go back one. Henry's going to tell us about what inspires him and what he uses for source material.
This is a bone. I found this is really a marvelous sculptural object. It has such variety in it, but yet such strength. And it has the turn, and it has completely different views from all round. It's an example of what I like in sculpture, of a form that you can't really know exactly. From here, if I'd only shown this view, I couldn't possibly know what it was going to be like from that view. And yet it's the same object. It isn't that it's a different object and therefore unguessable. It's really the same object and the same rhythm. But things happen that make you discover entirely new shapes as you look round it.
So there we have Henry. He's just so you know, he's in a studio. We need to go back one if we can. He's in his studio. That room you see behind him and up on the shelves, he is literally surrounded by these objects. That big thing, I think, on the turntable is a cow bone, which he's found somewhere. And in his studio, which is near his house in Hertfordshire, there are at least 3 other rooms like that with as much stuff in it. It's absolutely mind-blowing to see quite what the amount of source material that he had, from the tiniest thing you'd pick up on a beach to the larger bones he was just showing us now.
Was he fairly prolific at this point in his life then?
Oh God, yes. I mean, you see him there, a little man from Leeds, and you think, well, how on earth can he produce these great things? There was him and probably upwards of 15 to 20 assistants, most of which are artists or art graduates who are helping him behind the scenes. The technical aspect of casting sculpture, so that he would make from the bone that you see there, he will make what's called a model or a maquette, initially in clay, and then we'll make a plaster mold, rather like you would do on a detective show, a plaster mold of that piece, and from that plaster mold a small bronze maquette model, and from that you can then make anything, either something the same size or something 10 times the size. It's quite an extraordinary, it's an artisan skill as well as an artistic skill.
So we're going to have a look at a specific slide here known as King and Queen, if we could select that one. Now, this sculpture, Jonathan, from what I understand, a bit of a colourful past.
Yes, this is King and Queen, created between 1952 and 1953. And for those of you who follow these things, it was the coronation year, 1953. We need to go back one. 1953 was coronation year for Queen Elizabeth II. So there's a lot of talk about coronation and royalty, and it came to Henry's mind that he might produce something to commemorate this. And he produced King and Queen. Now you're looking at it, it's quite hard to get the scale. I think I made a note of this. So it's 164 centimeters, 1.6 meters high, and around about a meter and a half wide. And it's extraordinary.
A big thing, then, isn't it?
It is a big thing, yes. And originally, when they were made, there were four. So the model was made, then it was cast at this size, probably not before 1960. So it's a while before it popped up. So it was created and conceived, then cast later. It's quite an expensive business. And it was cast then. And at that point, there were four, two of which went to the Tate. One was sold to a museum in Japan. And there's this one, which remained for years until it was offered this March as the only one in private hands. So it's quite a sought-after item, but it came to, I suppose you'd call it notoriety in, I think it was 1993. It had sat peacefully in the Scottish countryside, been bought by a millionaire Scottish landowner, who then, when he died, it passed to his son. So it sat in the countryside in Dumfries, doing nobody any harm at all from 1960 to 1993. And then, for whatever reason, be it Scottish independence or something, some kind soul decided that he would chop both the heads off.
What?
And so, yes, armed with a saw, the two of them cut the heads off and then disappeared, leaving these two pieces sitting in their landscape situation with no heads. It was thought at the time that probably the heads would never be seen again, but somehow or other, I think probably through a bit of, it's sort of almost like the classical insurance claim, isn't it, really? What do you do? So you go and look for the heads. And so off someone went to see if they could find their heads, eventually found the heads, and the heads were expertly popped back on. I've seen this piece. I saw it before it was damaged and afterwards, and you literally can't tell. You can't see the join for sure.
Do you think that kind of story behind it actually adds to the thrill of it? Do you think people, I mean, obviously one in mint condition would have a certain value. Do you think that's detracted from it, or do you think it's actually boosted its value because of this story?
Well, pre-sale, I thought it might, but then afterwards, it didn't. I mean, it somehow or other, it added to it. I think you hit on something which perhaps may be surprising, but I think somehow, not that it was notorious, but people who had perhaps not heard of it through the story. And when it came up for auction at Christie's in March of this year, there was no secret about it. That I don't think anyone was trying to hide the fact that it had been in the wars a bit. But it remains the only one you can buy. So if you love this piece, people do, it's literally the only one you could buy. They cast two others, which were given to the Tate Gallery in London, and where it still is. So this is it. And so I think the expectation was between 15 and 20 million pre-auction, but afterwards, when the hammer came down, it made 25 million. So very nearly double low estimate expectation, with no concern at all for the damage because of the way it had been expertly restored.
Phenomenal. It's amazing what these people can do these days with something.
Yes, literally, you'd never have known. Yeah, you're right.
And if we move on to the next slide, if we would, please. And here we go, Jonathan. So the Time Life Screen Maquette. So, Jonathan, my understanding is you can still see the full-size finished version of this work in the West End. Is that true?
Yep. We've caught a quick glimpse of it, but we focus on this one first. This is a piece from 1952. It's much smaller than the piece we've been looking at. It's 32 centimeters high. And it's what we were discussing earlier. It's a maquette, a model for what would be a larger piece. And it was part of, or is still part of, what's known as the Time Life building on the corner of Bruton Street and New Bond Street, and it's literally on the corner. So you've got Hermes on one side underneath the building, and on the other side of the road is Burberry. So it's fashion central now, but back in the day, it was all about media and the arts. And so this tiny piece, and if we move on to the next slide, we'll see what it becomes.
But did Henry Moore, with all of his work, was it generally a thing that he always made a smaller maquette before building up and obviously used those as pieces to base his work on? Or was it almost a case that if he was commissioned to do something, he would be expected to create a maquette?
The maquettes were for him. So yes, to answer your first question, almost everything leads back to a maquette. There isn't much out there that doesn't begin with the source material that we saw him looking at. The bones and the stones and the things he picks up are where the ideas come from, and then from that he'll make the model and then a maquette and so on. So almost everything, it's like the sort of cycle of life, if you like. It begins with these little things, and he makes them into larger ones. So you can see from the maquette there are some slight changes to this piece, and it's worked up into I think this is Portland stone. And if you go to the studio, some of these screens or the working screens are still there. So he made full-size plaster versions of these before they were carved, and they had to be carved with industrial drills rather than hand and whatever, because of the complexity. But and there they are. So you're going shopping in Bond Street, you come down the hill a bit, you pass Sotheby's, and then on your left is Burberry's, and on your right, and look slightly up here, you can just see it above the Hermes shop. The Time Life building no longer has Time Life magazine in it. It's just general office buildings, but it's all still there from the 1950s. A very glamorous, sort of modern, stylish building.
Jonathan, these are all very, very big kind of projects, obviously, that Henry took on. In terms of what he was paid for these kind of jobs, and in terms of, and to be blunt about it, did he make a good living at it?
Yes, he made a very good living. Unluckily for him, it was made at a time when the UK or British tax regime was probably at its worst if you happen to be a high earner. I did some looking about, and in the 70s it was probably at its worst. And so if we took 1972, he had earned, Henry Moore, from his work, this is earned income, had earned just over a million, 1.1 million of pounds, so it's not bad for the time. 1.2 million, I think he'd earned. And he paid £960,000 in tax.
Oh, my word.
The tax regime at the time was, and that's a higher income rate of 83%. So you paid 83 pence in the pound tax. And I remember there's a photograph of the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jim Callaghan, who became the Prime Minister, standing next to Henry More, because he had been declared for that year the single highest payer of tax, the single highest individual taxpayer in the whole country. You wouldn't have thought that was a prize worth having, would you?
I was going to say, not the accolade that anyone wants.
Not that you'd want it, but and he seemed really quite, the chipper about it. But he was just earning good money at a time when indeed you weren't able to keep very much of it. But it forced him and his daughter Mary and his wife into considering the future. So following that, he turned the artist's collection, if you like. Each time he made something, there is what's called an artist's copy, an AC copy. Mm-hmm. And it remained the artist's. So there was a residual value in everything he made. And so all of these things stayed within his collection following his death, having been made into a charitable trust. Otherwise, it probably would all have had to have been sold and swallowed mostly up by tax.
So good planning does pay dividends.
Well, yes. And although I don't think he wanted to pay that sort of tax, he would consider himself successful. And he was producing, if you look at what's happening at the minute at Kew Gardens, if anybody's been to Kew Gardens, they'll know what I mean, that a lot of the bigger pieces, which are really enormous, that you sort of piece you'd walk around, are on display now, I think, until September, October at Kew Gardens, showing you these architectural works. So those probably were real money spinners in terms of what he might earn. But then, he's got a studio of 20 staff to pay. It's not like it's all going to go into his pocket.
No, it is fascinating, though, that even, when you look at people like, Damien and people like that, all still have a similar kind of studio where lots of art students and lots of graduates are all in there producing work. It isn't a new thing. When Henry More was doing exactly the same thing in his period.
But literally, if you look at the way a sculptor works, it is pretty much impossible for him or her to do everything themselves. So it boils down to the design work and the ideas belong to the artist, and then the craftspeople or artisans come in to make it work, as it were, or to make it happen, maybe. That's perhaps a better way of looking at it.
So, Jonathan, we'll move on to our next artist in our little rundown for today, and Elisabeth Frink.
Yes, Elisabeth Frink, who was, although spent most of her career in England, she was South African, born in 1930 and died in 1993, had a studio just outside Sherborne. And if you look, I don't know whether it's possible to go back to one slide before this one, where we see Elisabeth herself, or Liz, as she's often referred to. She's really quite a character. And what we see here is part of her output. She's sitting surrounded by what are known as goggle heads or heads. You can see the one to her left, to our left rather, is the goggle head, and the other one is simply a head. And there's another one behind him. That's part of her work. And if we move forward, we see the one we're going to talk about, which is Seated Man. If we go to the next slide, this is Seated Man that came up in March of this year. There it is, sort of sitting, resting in St. James's Park, because it's such a big piece. It's almost 2 meters high, about a meter across, and probably does weigh the best part of a ton, cast in bronze. Originally, these come rather like Henry More. They start as small plaster models, and they're worked up into a larger plaster model, and from that they're made into bronze castings. And this one is from an edition of 6. Now, when I say edition, I don't know whether anybody, maybe if I say limited edition, it's something that people are familiar with. And this, and many of the works that we see by Henry More and the other sculptors we'll see were produced in limited editions. And
were they always planned to be a certain number, or was it down to demand?
Both. they often, if you think about the Henry Moore King and Queen, originally that was going to be 4 because they thought that that's as many as they would sell, but then they managed to sell 2 more. So it's not set in stone. Something like, or someone like Liz Frink, her editions, this is an edition of 6. There'll be an artist copy, which is a 0, 0. So there's number 0 out of 0, and then number 1 out of 6, 2 out of 6, and so on. And it's unlikely, we'll talk a bit when we come to Epstein, we'll see, but generally speaking with Frink, the numbers are fixed. With Moore, sometimes they can change, and with other artists sometimes, but mostly you know. So one of the nice things about this is if you're thinking about sculpture, and in one of the few areas with an original painting, if it's lost or stolen or destroyed, well, that's sort of it. But there is a chance if your sculpture is destroyed that there is another one from the edition somewhere. So you might be able to replace almost like with like, which is unusual.
With all of the artists that we're talking about as contemporary sculptors, is there a certain scenario where things were redone maybe and recast after their death?
Yes. And it's an area, it's sort of commonly known as a grey area that people feel, but certainly with, if you think of someone like Henri Godier-Bresca or someone that no one's ever heard of like him, he didn't live long enough or have enough money to produce any sculptures while he was alive, but he made drawings of what he thought of and some models. So he died just after the First World War, but his pieces weren't cast until the 1970s because people rediscovered. So it can happen, yes, it's unusual. And it needs to be done in a way that's transparent, because people are rather, one of the areas of fakery, if you like, in sculpture is where a piece is cast from another piece. So logically, it's microscopically larger because you're using it as the origin for a mold. So people are a bit wary of it.
I presume in this, again, it's provenance, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, looking at this Frink piece here, it made £400,000 in a March auction, and these are highly collectible. And Liz she was horse and dog mad, and so if you from after this look up and see what else she does, some of the dogs are literally breathtaking. There's one dog which is one of hers, which wherever you go, I've seen the same dog. It's from an edition of 8 or 10 possibly. And wherever it is in anyone's home, it's a life-size hound, I guess. It's sort of not quite a pointer, but it's that sort of dog. And everywhere you go, the top of its head is shining, where people simply can't resist stroking it or patting it as they go past, or sort of stroking its nose. They're very, very tactile, livable things. She did a piece for Great Ormond Street Hospital, which was done in an edition of 50, which is a big edition. Most editions are 10 or under. And it originally sold for about £10,000 each, I think. But now that same piece, because it's so wonderful, it's about the size of a kettle, your home boiling kettle. Whenever it comes up, it makes anything between 30, 40, even £50,000 because it's so lovely.
Not a bad investment on that front, that's for sure.
Yeah, and they're very, very livable things, these, and her work is great. The horses are just to die for.
The horses are gorgeous. No,
Yeah.
I see a lot of the horses, and they are beautifully done, and just the most totally suitable thing to have a nice kind of piece on a little table. They're just perfectly sized as well. They're just gorgeous little things.
Yeah, and rather like the Henry Moore, they can be a bit Henry Moore King and Queen. I've dealt with a couple of the life-size horses which are cast in aluminium, where they were removed from their location, in other words, stolen. They did come back because they're quite tricky to hide, but so that all of these things probably need some security in a garden and proper insurance, but it's worth the effort. They're glorious things.
Moving on to our next artist, Jonathan, Jacob Epstein. Let's chat about him.
Yeah, he's quite a character. You can see almost, here's a photograph of him with one of his mistresses. And he was very strong. He's American, which is unusual for sculptures, but he came over to Britain just after the First World War. He was born in 1889, so I think he came over here in the 20th century and died in 1959. And where he differs from the others is that he begins as an abstract or conceptual sculptor at the beginning of the century, probably 1918, 1920. And his work is carved and cast. But then in the 1920s and 30s, he sort of becomes a portrait sculptor in the same way that people have portraits painted of the chairman of the board or a famous person. Epstein's thing was to make portraits in bronze of various people, the most famous of which is probably Winston Churchill. And for those of you who occasionally watch President Trump talking in the Oval Room in the White House, if you look at the Donald, usually behind him on the right is a little head of Winston Churchill. It's in a very dark, it's a black finish to it. But over his, or Donald's left-hand shoulder, you can see sort of Churchill watching proceedings. And that piece, depending on the stripes of the president, so a Democrat would remove Churchill from the Oval Room, whereas a Republican such as the Donald has brought the Winston Churchill Epstein head out into the open again. It's almost like he's listening to, I put something on Instagram once showing the Donald talking and Winston almost perched on his shoulder watching it. It seemed rather ironic.
I wonder if he's going to get one made of Keir. I doubt it.
Yes, and especially if you think about it, that he is not too far from a man with the same first initial. This is Jeffrey Epstein meets Jacob Epstein.
Yeah. Yes.
But this is. So I think the next slide shows us some of the famous people he sculpts. Here we are. This is a wonderful one of Einstein, which came up for sale in March this year, and it's a 1930s piece, and there's quite a few of those. And for those of you following prices, the Einstein was expected to make in between 40 and 60,000 pounds, and in the end made just over 100,000. And I can never quite work. I think it's a mixture of interest growing in Epstein, but also the interest in the sitters, if you like. And that's a really super piece. It has a what's called a green pattern, and it's slightly green tint to it, but it's a very chummy sculpture. It's not large. It's about 35, 40 centimeters high, 43 centimeters high.
So almost a desktop then, isn't it, really?
Yeah, exactly, yes. A desktop, or if you're Donald Trump, it's a shelf top piece with all your other trophies. I think that we see the next slide, please. We've got Lillian Shelley from 1920. I'm not sure I know who she is, but there's Joseph Conrad and the singer Paul Robeson from 1927. And that the image that you see there is quite extraordinary. It's not, it looks brown there, but it's an extraordinarily deep, rich black. I tried to buy one of those years ago, and somehow or other it evaded me. But they used to be about 10 or 15,000 pounds. So probably now they're heading towards 50. And next to him is George Bernard Shaw, very distinctive character. So I think the beauty of these famous people heads, if you want to call them that, is that they're instantly recognizable and very tactile as well. And they used to be quite difficult to sell, again, because people weren't quite sure where to put them, but that seems to have gone by the wayside now. And
those kind of prices, Jonathan, they strike me as still being relatively obtainable in comparison to Henry Moore, for example.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you could, if you and I, or anybody listening or listening to this, has got, I know it's still money, it's, let's say, 5,000 quid. You could you could buy a small Henry Moore sculpture for that sort of money. So literally the prices go from £5,000 to £25 million. That there aren't that many artists with that range of value.
It's quite the spread, isn't it?
Yeah, or you could buy an etching of sheep by Henry Moore, which he did towards the end of his life, sheep in a field, because he had sheep in his field where his studio was, and that'll cost you probably about £1,500 or maybe even less. So these are all expensive, but not everything they make is expensive. You could buy an Epstein view of, let me think now, Still Life of Flowers for about £5,000, and believe it or not, a view of Epping Forest for about 1,500 or 2,000. I don't quite know why he spent so much time in Epping Forest, but anyway, they're quite affordable.
Yes. There seems to be quite a lot of, should I say, realism, but tinged with a touch of abstract to his sculpture work as well.
Yes, there's spirit there, isn't there? Yes, that you know who they are, but somehow they're strengthening either their look or something. There's an X factor there. That's right.
Moving on then, Jonathan, to Emily Young.
Sorry, you go on.
No, I was going to say with Emily Young, I think she's kind of one of those artists, really, that kind of splits opinion quite a lot. But what's your view on it?
My view is she's one of my favourites. Emily Young is the only, rather dismally, this is the only sculptor that's still alive in this talk today. All the others have died, but Emily is a living and working sculptor, born in 1951, and working mostly in alabaster, although stone, the piece that she's resting against here is limestone. But she harks back to, so it's a combination of a modern sculptor working today and at the cutting edge of her craft, but working in what can only be described as traditional methods. So working straight into alabaster or stone, and producing really quite extraordinary pieces. And her work appears at auction regularly. I think the next slide will show us an example. This is a piece, as we can see, Purbeck Blue Angel from 1999. And you're starting off with Purbeck blue marble. So the color it looks a bit gray in this image, but it is blue with a hint of gray, and very, very intense piece. And this was offered again in March of this year. Estimate range was 100 to 150,000, sold in the middle of that at 127,000 pounds. Now, what's unusual about this is the fact that here is someone working in traditional methods, but here's someone who has come to the auction market really at a relatively early stage. I know she's born in 1951, but at the same time, she has a market both at auction and at exhibition. In other words, what they call primary market. So that's first piece comes to market, and secondary. So on a sort of, if I can put it bluntly, on an investment principle, here's someone whose market is wide ranging and very, very accessible. I don't think there are any small pieces, and a lot of these are made to commission, but it really is very interesting and exciting to see someone doing so well at auction.
In terms of the fact that they're made from marble, Jonathan, I presume that these are one-off pieces then?
Absolutely, yes. It's an interesting point that we talked earlier about editions and therefore multiples, but this is a unique piece. There are no casts or editions of this. This is a one-off piece. Yes, that's quite right.
So in terms of when we look at obviously the desirability of such things as one-offs, would that indicate to you, I mean, for example, if Henry Moore had produced one-off pieces to the same kind of level, that work would obviously be worth far more than if there were 4 or 5 of them?
You'd think so, but I think Henry Moore somehow is an exception because there's so little of his work that is unique. That there are some very early pieces, but somehow the early pieces are not as developed or as desirable. But at the same time, it doesn't limit his market. It doesn't bother, as we saw with King and Queen, it doesn't bother people that much that there's more than one. The one that we were looking at.
Enough.
Sorry?
It's unique enough.
Yes, exactly. And people don't, and in a way, they see it as positive. There is more. So if you miss one, obviously there could be another. But also, if there is never going to be another one, like King and Queen, in other words, it's the last one, then there's an X factor. It might as well be unique if you think about it, because that's the only one you can buy.
So, Reg Butler, then, let's talk about him for a little while.
Yes, now Reg is perhaps one of the less well-known. No, we have some more pieces by. So here's Reg working. And we had, I forgot, we had a couple more large pieces by Emily Young. The other one on the right-hand side is a rather wonderful disc, which is, if you like, an oversized coin-shaped piece, but very beautiful. So you've got the mixture of light coming through the stone.
And is it a very, very thin piece of stone? Is that how you got the different pieces? Wow.
Yeah, it's like a giant penny, as it were, but it's made of stone.
So let's see, we got to Reg Butler.
Now, Reg is probably, he's not one of the least known figures, but what he's known for, he was born in 1913 and then died in 1981. But a lot of his work, including the pieces that we see here, all come from the 1950s, where he's producing work which is popular. But somehow, I put him here because I think somehow he's rather overlooked, but I think it's twofold, that he's overlooked because perhaps his work was ahead of its time at the time in the 50s, and now looking back, you could regard it as cutting edge. So maybe I would describe Reg Butler as one to look out for, if you know what I mean. There is a next piece. You can see him on the right there working on a piece called Girl with Vest. You can see she's taking the vest off, her hands are behind her head and sort of pulling the vest up. And he's not carving that piece, it's a bronze. He's sort of just shaping it and finishing it off.
Now, given the size of these sculptures and obviously kind of the material they're made from, would that be something that would live outside, or would that be a centerpiece to a room? How would these, where would they be positioned?
You can position these inside or out. There are various treatments you can. We talked about King and Queen being outside, and it was for all of its life. Equally, this piece is bronze. It can easily live outside, but I've always felt that there probably is. It's worth not just leaving it outside and forgetting about it. Many of the restorers will offer to effectively service your bronze. What happens is when you put them outside, depending on where they're going to be, they can be waxed, and that involves just a thin layer of wax over the whole surface, which can be removed, which will protect it from the elements. But theoretically, they can just live outside. They don't really rust as such. Bronze is quite hardy. So the only thing that could happen is if they were damaged or I guess stolen. But generally speaking,
seems to be a big thing with bronze sculptures, unfortunately, doesn't it? Obviously, there's a famous case with Henry Moore's ones from a few years ago, but there seems to be not an insignificant amount that do tend to have problems, shall we say?
Yeah, this is the piece that you see Reg working on, which is on the next slide. Also, is it was this particular one that we're going to see now. It was estimated at 10 to 15,000, so it's a smaller version of Girl with Vest. So it's probably about, I think now, it's 55 centimeters high. The one we saw him working on is about, nearly as tall as him. So this is a smaller version, estimated at 10 to 15 and made £22,000. So that probably, because of its size, would live indoors anyway. So the bigger ones would be outdoors. If you go somewhere, I think Chatsworth is quite a good example. If you look from the back of Chatsworth, if you look down the gardens, they have Elisabeth Frink horses at the bottom. So you can sort of place some things where you might expect them to be, or where you see Anthony Gormley sculptures.
I was about to mention Anthony Gormley up in Liverpool, which was yes.
But they're made of cast iron, and they will, unlike bronze, and they're in the water. There's one There's an Anthony Gormley on the Thames at near Narrow Street, where the Thames narrows through all the warehouses, and that's on a plinth in the middle of, not quite in the middle of the edge of the Thames. So you see them in all sorts of places. So they're quite versatile. But this is an indoor piece.
Okay. Now, we saw a brief glimpse of him a second ago. Barry Flanagan, Jonathan.
Yes, yes. Barry, he looks quite cool, doesn't he, there with his fag and bow tie.
Good setup, isn't it? Yes, absolutely.
He's quite a player. And I'm not sure what the pieces are he's showing there. I mean, what you see there is not what he's known for. This is probably quite early. And Barry was, let me just think, I've written it down somewhere. Barry was born in 1941 and he died in 2009. So sadly, a bit sooner than you would expect for someone of his generation. But he was born in Wales, and so is thought of as a British sculptor. But then he took Irish citizenship in 2000. So I think what he did it for was, if you live in Ireland as an artist, you pay zero tax on your earnings as an artist, and I think the same can apply to musicians and so on. You make a saving by so it enhances society. So Barry moved to Ireland, but the plus was that he became officially Irish. So he doubled his market overnight. So he was, people loved him anyway in the UK and America. But then the Irish really went for him because they loved the whole idea of his subject matter, which is predominantly hares, Hares.
I was going to say, I think our next slide depicts one of his works on that front. He was very well known for hares, Jonathan, but did he do many other animals, or?
Not many others, but certainly he did do other animals, specifically elephants.
Oh gosh,
you wouldn't have expected that, would you? But if you go to, if ever you're visiting New York and you have 5 minutes to spare and you're on 6th Avenue, just opposite Radio City, where they have the variety shows. I think it's Radio City or something.
Right.
6th Avenue, there's a group of buildings there. Just by the Hilton, just in between Radio City and the Hilton Hotel, there are a series of modern buildings with fountains out the front, but in between the buildings are sculptures, all of which are by Barry Flanagan. So there's a giant hare, there's an elephant with a hare on it, on its back, and then a hare with an elephant on it. So a big hare with a little elephant on top, and a big elephant with a little hare on top. Dotted in between the buildings.
That's got a certain degree of Donnie Darko to it, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, he saw himself as the hare. That was his sort of alter ego, was a hare. He just had this thing about the freedom that a hare has to run. And in Ireland, the hare is much more significant. They still do hare coursing, which is, I think, now illegal here. So hunting with dogs and chasing hares. But it's that sort of freedom of spirit, and so the hare becomes a feature of various other things. So this one is standing. Sometimes you have them on metallic shapes. Sometimes you have one on top of the other. So one standing like this with another one doing a sort of somersault and resting on his head. There's all sorts of varieties. So the one we're looking at here is 1.5 meters high, so it's a good size, and it's
a big size.
Oh,
yes, it's a big size.
And there are little ones. The small ones are obviously cheaper, but this is 1.5 meters high. It dates from 1993 and was offered in the March auction we've been talking about. Expected to make 120 to 180,000 and made just over 200,000. And there's over life size hares. I've sold 2 in my career, both made in excess of 300,000 for over life size hares, which are rarer and just bigger. But he's an extraordinary man, and perhaps one of my heroes. This one is, we talked about editions. This is number 1 of an edition of 8, so there are 7 others. like this.
They seem to all be kind of single figure kind of editions with sculptors, with obviously aside from the more traditional kind of things, but the bronze artists would generally kind of produce them at a guess kind of under 10 per production.
Yeah. I mean, the cost of casting is prohibitive for something like this. It's 1.5 meters high. I imagine if you're gonna make it, it's probably 40 to 50,000 pounds to make it. I visited some of the foundries where they make these, and it's extraordinary to watch. It's both extraordinarily modern, but also archaic. They're casting in the same way that you would have done in Rome 2,000 years ago. It's some of it is old school, some of it is brand spanking new school. We haven't talked about patina, and that's maybe something we can talk about at some point. But the color is important. The artist sort of surrenders the model to make the larger piece, and so it goes off to the artisans to be made, and then the artist returns. Elisabeth, Frink, or Henry Moore, anybody like that, would supervise what's called the patina, so the color. So when it comes out of the factory or the furnace, if you like, it's rather a sort of hodgepodge of grey and burnt bits and a bit knobbly. So it needs to be finished and brought down to something that looks, take all the sharp edges off, but then it's given a colour, a patina, which is etched through acid into it so that it has an overall colour. So you'll see sometimes things from the same edition which are different colours.
So there's still actually work involved in actually producing the piece after it's been cast?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And that often involves either the artist personally doing that work, him or herself, or them supervising someone doing it.
And I think we've got a few more examples of his work next, haven't we, Jonathan, on the next slide?
I think so.
Let's have a look at some of those.
Yeah,
so yes, he's clearly fond of the hares.
he loves hares. But you know what? You never get bored of them because they're all different in their way. So he really lets his imagination run away.
I was going to say, you wouldn't imagine that the first one and the second one are almost by the same person, especially the different types of plinth. The form of them just isn't similar.
Yeah, no, but they're distinctive in their way, and I think one of the happy circumstances of the life-size pieces, of the over-large pieces, when, like Henry Moore, they become part of architectural development. So you're building an albeit relatively unattractive office building, and something like this in the alleyways and in between streets can lift the whole project.
Absolutely. Now, Jonathan, moving on to probably one of your favourite and one of my favourite artists, which is Barbara Hepworth.
Right. Yeah. So here we see Barbara manhandling what actually is a plaster model of what will become a bronze piece. So this is sort of one up from the maquette. It's a plaster version of something that will be cast in bronze. And Barbara Hepworth was almost a contemporary of Henry Moore.
Were they at each other's, kind of, were they rivals? Were they both trying to look
I think they were.
Yeah.
I think Henry Moore was pretty grumpy about having someone. Basically, Henry Moore came from Leeds and Barbara Hepworth from Wakefield. So not only were they rivals, if you like, they were both born not that far away from each other, and not that different time, as it were. She was born in 1903 and died in 1975. So they're both working at the same time, at a time when, it was not usual for women to be working. And if you look at what she's making here, these are really quite manly pieces of sculpture, and also things that she's carving herself. But there was definitely a rival. I don't know how you would describe it, but I think she was pretty chilled about the whole thing. I don't think she had extraordinarily, she had triplets, just to add complication. We'll see a photograph in a minute, but she had triplets, so she had her hands full with looking after triplets, as well as producing sculptures for exhibition.
I was going to say, doing sculpture with three children probably isn't the
Well,
most
again,
tasks, but
if you go to New York or go to Oxford Street, you go to New York and look at the United Nations building. Out front is an enormous sculpture, which is by Barbara Hepworth from the 1960s. And on the I don't know which edge you'd call it. I think it's Hollis Street and Oxford Street on the side of John Lewis is another 60s piece by Barbara Hepworth. And it's about...
So a lot of contemporary councils at the time were buying these works to put up. And I mean, it's something you can't even imagine these days, can you? That, you know, borough councils or various other people, I mean, see it occasionally with museums, but I'm presuming that when they were buying them as modern pieces, as brand new pieces, it was proving to be, whilst obviously beneficial for the artist, they weren't, you know, worth as much probably as they are now.
You know what? I don't think there was even a discussion about value. That the worth, if you like, at the time was what it was going to cost to buy it. So it was the outlay. There was no concept necessarily of either increased value over time. It was really quite open thinking. It wasn't restrained by what the value might be or any concerns. It was artistic and aesthetic choices at the time. And in an attempt to encourage British sculptors and British artists to make their work and to support them. It was a post-war phenomenon, if you like.
It's ironic, really, that they were trying to encourage them by buying all these items, but still charging them % tax, really, isn't it? But,
yes, it was an extraordinarily difficult tax regime, if you like. It's why the Beatles left and Sean Connery and all those people left to go and live in Switzerland or somewhere where they weren't paying all of their earnings in tax.
Absolutely. I think George Harrison wrote a particularly damning song about that. But where can you actually, in this modern age, go and see Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore's work?
Surprisingly easily, if you like. If we start with Barbara Hepworth, if you wanted to see her work, you just get on the train and go to Wakefield. And you get a cab which takes about 10 minutes or less, to the Hepworth, so a museum named after Barbara Hepworth. She was born and bred in Wakefield, went to Wakefield Grammar, and is in the same way that you might have a son of Wakefield, Barbara is the daughter of Wakefield. And so there's a centre of study there for her work. And also they have a sculpture park, not quite adjacent to the museum, but not far off, where the larger pieces are on display with other artists, such as Rachel White-Reed and contemporary female sculptors. So it's a journey, but a relatively easy one.
And I think on our next slide, we've got a few more examples of Barbara's work, have we?
Yeah. And Henry Moore, you can see at his studio in Much Haddam, which is up in Hertfordshire. I've driven there. It's much harder to find than you think, because Much Haddam is tiny. But when you go, it's a blast, an absolute blast, because you're surrounded by his pieces in the landscape, and you can go around his house and go around his studio, and there's a cafe. It literally is a day out.
It's funny though, Jonathan. Yep.
If we have a look at this, sorry, you carry on.
I was going to say, not so long ago, I was at in Harlow, and they've been very, very positive with all of their contemporary sculptures that they have around there, and you can here, there, and everywhere around the entire place, be it a town or a city, I'm not sure, but there seems to be a lot of sculptures and a lot of good contemporary sculpture that seems to be on display there. Do a lot of councils still kind of proactively seek out modern sculptors, as in not kind of legacy people such as Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore, but is there a lot of sculptural buying going on now?
I don't know. I think that they would. You find it's often part of the Bishopsgate development in London and other things you see. So not necessarily councils, because they perhaps would invite or encourage a sculptor to provide a work of art, but I don't know whether they would buy it, sadly. Harlow Newtown was built in the 50s, and it's a shining example, as you say, of the council and individuals on the council with an interest in art and artists, putting them at the forefront. I don't think it happens in the same way. But where a business, a property developers or whatever and the like, are trying to persuade local authorities to accept the development, they will put sculpture in it as a sort of way of softening the pill, or whatever it is, sugarcoating what may otherwise be something that not everybody wants, by offering to provide or pay for sculpture to be part of the development. We haven't really. This is. We've been talking about editions. This is by Barbara Hepworth, curved form from 1960, and is a unique piece. It's. I just think it's 46 centimeters high, so it's quite easy to manage, and it's just utterly gorgeous. The whole thing is simply beautiful, and it's made from walnut wood. And a piece of this size almost certainly will be made personally by Barbara Hepworth. It came up in the same March auction we've been talking about. It was a unique work, expected to make £700,000 to £1 million, and sold for just over £1 million, so made £1 million all in. And if I can say it, it's a very sexy piece, isn't it? Really,
it flows, doesn't it?
Just I think flows.
The transition of the colours, I think, is fantastic, and even the slightly offset positioning on the plinth means it's it's just quirky, and I think very, very of her style. Absolutely.
I had an artist friend who worked for Barbara Hepworth, Terry Frost. So he's an artist someone may have heard of, and Terry's job was as an assistant to Barbara Hepworth. And Barbara was always welcome visitors to her studio in St Ives. She had 2 studios, but she didn't want anyone to come and see her working with a team of people. She was convinced that if people saw that there were other people making these things, they wouldn't want to buy them. So whenever anybody came, Terry said Barbara made them all hide somewhere in the grounds until they'd gone away.
Gosh, and Terry Frost, a very, very famous and brilliant artist in his own right, of course.
And very funny too.
Jonathan, it's been absolutely fascinating today, and I thank you very, very much for your time.
I'll ask you a question, Alastair.
Yes, absolutely.
Out of all the things we've been looking at, what would you choose if you had the choice of a piece from today's?
I really like Lizzie Frink's horses, and I think there are some gorgeous pieces out there, kind of around 30 inches wide around there, and they're just beautiful things, and you can almost put them anywhere. I think for me, Henry Moore has always been a little bit too big and brutal in terms of what he did for my kind of an idea. The smallest point of realism, I think, is often quite nice. But again, I think with Barbara Hepworth, she's got that kind of similar to Henry Moore in kind of their influences, clearly, but I think is a little bit more kind of accessible to a lot of people in my mind, in size, and well, it certainly used to be in price, but not so much so anymore. But I like Anthony Gormley quite a lot, obviously spending a lot of time in Liverpool as yourself. It's one of those kind of standout pieces, I think, that everyone knows Anthony Gormley particularly well. But now I think of all the people in there and of all the subject matters, I think Lizzie Frink's stuff is astonishing and very livable. But I think all of them, to a certain degree, I think of the smaller sorts, obviously you wouldn't all be able to have King and Queen in your front room, but I think they're all very livable items.
Yes, I agree with you. I think for me, it's Liz Frink, and there's one piece called Rolling Over Horse. And I've never ridden a horse, but even I can see the charm of what effectively is a horse it's a cast of a horse in a field, but rolling over. So its legs are in the air, and it's rolling on its back, just having a great deal of fun rolling on some hay or whatever. And everybody loves that piece, and it's just the ideal size as well.
But I think it's very hard.
It always makes 50,000 quid. Reliably, is the auctioneer's favourite. Is that one, because it's a dead cert for 50,000 quid or near enough.
And we all want a horse that's a dead cert. That's for sure. Right. Well, I don't think we have any questions from the panel here, but I'd just like to say thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Absolutely fantastic. Please do get in touch if there's any other subjects that you'd like us to talk about on these webinars. We will be doing a series of them over the summer. As I say, I hope you're all keeping relatively cool, and we will all speak to you very soon. If you do have any questions for myself or for Jonathan or any one of the team, please do feel free to drop us an email with any questions with regards to this or valuations, and no doubt we'll be in touch very soon. So Jonathan, thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. Pleasure.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye everyone. Bye-bye.